It's November 17th, 1922, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
Now, I found some archive news footage about the event that happened on this day, and it begins, "Fury in the land of the Fez." And I thought two things about that. One, I wish the news was still like that a bit. And two, that is a neat enough summary. So here goes. Today there was fury in the land of the Fez because this was the day that the 36th and last Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Mehmet VI, stepped onto a British warship to seek refuge in Malta.
And I found some photos of him leaving, and he goes through the back door of his palace. And I tell you what, there's a lot of fezzes about. Everyone is wearing a fez.
What's all the fez about? That would have been a good headline as well. Even Pathé wouldn't do jokes like that.
But he left apparently accompanied by his first Chamberlain, his doctor, two confidential secretaries, a valet, a barber, two eunuchs, and his bandmaster.
I never go anywhere without my eunuchs.
Yeah, but I was thinking particularly about the bandmaster, and I thought that would have been the toughest assignment. Like, make music appropriate for being exiled. It's sad, but it's not too sad.
Seeking asylum with dignity, please.
Please don't play it too loudly because we are sort of sneaking out the back door. So like quiet,
Right.
but cautiously optimistic exile music.
And also, usually you're composing for an orchestra, but this time you've got two eunuchs and a barber.
And it's truly astonishing, really, to think that you can see newsreel footage of the end of an empire which had started in the 14th century and continued in an unbroken line for those hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Now we can just see it all unravelling on old sort of, just old newsreel. It's incredible, really.
I agree. You think of the Sultan and you think of images from like the 1700s and stuff. The idea that there's black and white photographs of this guy, that he died the year before my grandma was born. She's still alive. This is actually really recent. And the way he was living with those eunuchs, with his harem of 5 wives, was basically how they've lived for centuries before that.
Yes, and that whole business of the fact that they started out fighting the Byzantines and now they're involved in World War One. And it was World War One that was so involved in the decline of the Ottomans, not least because the Ottoman Empire had ended up siding with Germany, but also that its territory had been in decline for some time and now it was being broken up by treaty by the Allied powers who had subsequently gone on to win the war.
Yeah, but the rot had set in as early as the 19th century, and like most powerful empires, it simply just got too big for its own good. At its largest, it spanned from the Persian Gulf to Hungary and included parts of North Africa and parts of modern-day Russia as well. And this was all well and good for hundreds of years. And so one issue was that Europe had always considered the Ottoman Empire to be this kind of Muslim boogeyman, at the door. And so there was this concerted effort on behalf of European powers to consciously undermine at every turn. But also in the 1700s and 1800s, you had the rise of nationalist ideology, the idea that all of these modern day nations, and I think it's something like 37 modern day countries were once part of the Ottoman Empire. You had all of these groups emerging, demanding their own independence. And once that kind of internal dissent had taken hold, it was pretty hard to root out. I mean, they had tried. In 1908, they agreed to move to a constitutional monarchy, but by that point, it was really just too late. And also, the Ottoman Empire was quite far behind Europe in terms of industrialization, mass education. There's estimate that only 10% of the subjects of the empire were literate in 1914. So obviously, they were lagging quite a way behind their rivals. And then it was just World War I which really formed this kind of death blow to the empire because they'd made this, in retrospect, disastrous decision to ally themselves with the Triple Alliance in World War I.
I found that statistic as well about literacy, and it's an astonishing lack of education. And simultaneously, as you say, they were way too agrarian. The Industrial Revolution had almost missed them. And so at the point at which Great Britain, France and Russia started building heavy weaponry, they just could not keep up militarily.
Well, Mehmet himself could write and read, and on the 16th of November, the day before, he'd written to Sir Charles Harrington, "Sir, considering my life in danger in Istanbul, I take refuge with the British government and request my transfer as soon as possible from Istanbul to another place," and then signed it Mehmed VI, Caliph of the Muslims. Now that was a bit of a reverse ferret, because at the beginning of that month he'd said he was going to cling on, that he was the leader of the Muslim world, which obviously he's still asserting by signing a letter like that, but that he had the military powers on his side, he wasn't going anywhere. But what happened is there was then this sort of burgeoning Turkish government being formed, and they had to decide how future caliphs were going to be appointed and what powers they would have. And the initial criteria that they were going to use would be that the replacement for this sultan would be a member of the imperial family who was the wisest, most honest, and best educated. Which would be a really interesting criteria if you applied it to our royal family now, wouldn't it? Instead of having a line of succession, imagine that. Like, how do you actually, did you go with literally with an IQ test? Like, how do you do that?
Oh, man. Who wins that in our royal family?
To be fair, if they had been doing it like that, Mehmet would have been a pretty good contender. Like, he was very educated, very amiable kind of guy, very fond of calligraphy and music, and also harem life. But, you know, who wouldn't be? He'd only been the Sultan for 4 years at this point, though. The empire may have been going on for, you know, like 700 years at this point, but he'd actually only had a very small taste. And so you can understand why, as the Ottoman Empire was being partitioned by the Allies at the end of World War I, his focus was all about maintaining the dynasty, and to the point where he was acceding to basically all these Allied demands, where they were carving up the whole empire to the point where all that would have been left was basically part of modern day Turkey. And to the Turkish nationalists, this was a completely repulsive move on this point, and just kind of sealed his fate. At first he did try and work with them, but I think eventually they were just too disgusted by his behaviour, which seemed to be putting his own power above the future of the empire.
Especially because his predecessor, Mehmed V, had lost the empire's northern African territories in the Italo-Turkish War and lost almost all of the empire's European territories west of Constantinople, now Istanbul, in the First Balkan War. So, you know, there was this massive reduction of the territory controlled by the Ottomans even before he stepped into power, part of which was being girded with this ceremonial sword. And I absolutely loved reading about something that involved the word girt that wasn't my national anthem.
Well, reading accounts from the time, the other thing that struck me was the sort of schadenfreude that there was in the West, really, about this event, his escape. You know, the Chicago Tribune wrote him up as, quote, a broken, solitary old man, trembling in constant terror of assassination, who took refuge on this tiny, rocky scrap of island fortress lost in the middle of the Mediterranean. They're talking about Malta. Yeah, they make it sound like they're talking about Alcatraz. I mean, I'm sure it was grim for him, having had this incredible life living in palaces, but it's not that grim. I mean, he was alive. He was being looked after. He did have his people with him.
Well, yeah, and he lived out the rest of his life on the Italian Riviera, so it was hardly like, you know, Napoleon in exile on St. Helena or something. You know, he was living a pretty comfortable existence.
It wasn't so magnificent for the royal family. Mehmed's first cousin and heir, Abdul Mejid Effendi, he was the next person to be elected caliph before it all came crumbling down. Notably not a sultan. The last sultan was Mehmed VI. But very quickly in 1924, the entire Ottoman Sultanate and Caliphate was abolished, and 156 people belonging to the royal family were then completely expelled. They were denied citizenship, they were given one-way passports, and their palaces were ransacked. And apparently they really couldn't find almost anywhere to settle. Eventually they ended up in Beirut. But a lot of them were reduced to reportedly washing dishes, even begging and searching bins for food. I mean, those reports, you could imagine, could have been yet more of this triumphalism of the fall of the Ottoman Empire.
Look how far they've fallen.
Yeah, by the people who are now writing history. But even so, it does sound as though the family were given short shrift all around.
It's the question, I suppose, of what do you do when your job is to be in the royal family and then the royal family no longer exists. I was thinking, I've read something recently about, I think it was a government minister from Afghanistan who was working as a delivery driver. He was like a bike courier in Germany. You know, and it's like, there's no reason not to take that job, right? You know, you can't live off of your status in your original country.
There was no option then to do an interview with Oprah, was there?
Yeah. And also his skill set. Mehmed VI, he was a poet, he was a writer, he had amazing calligraphy, but then he could play this instrument called the kanun, and I was like, nope, internet, no idea. And the internet was like, it's a kind of zither. I was like, nope, still not internet. It's a harpy kind of string thing. But what are you going to do with those skills, really?
Yeah, we're like, Mehmet, have you considered retraining and going into STEM?
Do you know that the first Sultan, Osman, said that the empire had come to him in a dream in 1299? Like this show. This show came to me in a dream. I'm like the Sultan. Yeah.
May it last 623 years.
And if only your dreams were a little bit more ambitious, Olly.
I know. In his dream, apparently, a tree burst out of his chest.
Oh, that doesn't sound good.
Mine was just like, I don't know, there's something about talking about days in history.
And here we all are.
Ottoman Empire, podcast empire.
Tomorrow.
According to Empire at the time, the trailer created, quote, online congestion not seen since the publication of the Star Report.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, part of the Acast Creator Network.